Good morning, namaskar everyone, and welcome to this latest Indica Books Q&A. And uh, I am doubly happy, honored, and delighted to be doing this. You all know this is no surprise. You can see the virtual background that this is a Q&A with the distinguished economist, author, and particularly translator, Sanskrit translator, Shri Bibek Debroy. While he is the chairperson of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, we are going to be talking to him today more with respect to his work as a Sanskrit translator. Now, for those of you who are not aware, and I really doubt if that is the case, but if you're not aware, Shri Bibek Debroy has, for the last 12 years, he has embarked on a massive mammoth project of translating our epics into English. And when I say translating, I mean the unabridged editions of our epics, starting with the unabridged Mahabharata, then the Harivamsha, then the Valmiki Ramayana. And then he started on his project of translating the Mahapuranas, starting with the 3-volume Bhagavat Purana, then the 1-volume Markandeya Purana, then the 2-volume Brahma Purana, and very, very recently, just a few weeks back, his latest translation of the Vishnu Purana also came out. So I have a lot of questions to ask him, and I'm sure as do you. And this Q&A is being live streamed on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube, and you can watch them on from either of those platforms. And do send in your questions. We'll take the questions one by one as they come. And without further ado, I will invite Shri Bibek Debroy, and namaskar, sir.
Namaskar.
So, uh, as I said, there are a ton of questions that were in my mind, but as of now, I don't think I have a specific plan of questions. So I'll start with the very, very basic question. You have uh, you have set upon translating the Itihasa and the Puranas. You're done with the Itihasa, which is the Mahabharata and then the Valmiki Ramayana, and you are now on to your fourth Mahapuran translation. Before I get to the Mahapuranas, I want to ask you two questions. First of all, why did you pick this project up of translating the unabridged Mahabharata? 1 lakh shlokas, if you look at the critical edition, that is about 73,000 shlokas. So please tell us, why did you pick this project up? Why did you pick, and what is the critical edition, or the Bodhi critical edition as it is called, and why in English?
Let me step back a little bit. At a slightly philosophical level, I could say, and I do believe that, I could say that I'm merely the agent, I'm merely the instrument. It's not that I've consciously decided to do all of these things. It's just being done through me. But that's at a philosophical level. At a more mundane level, English has become extremely popular as the language of use amongst the younger generation. It's also important from the point of view of global dissemination. Quite often, we are familiar with something like the Mahabharata, but we are familiar with a very dumbed down version of the Mahabharata. Everything is reduced to black and white. The Kauravas are bad, the Pandavas are good, so on and so forth. The Mahabharata, or the Puranas for that matter, they are much more complicated than that. They are much more nuanced. The reason I got into this was because not too many people who are Indologists, who specialize in Sanskrit, were particularly interested in translating these. Let me give an example of that. We had an entire series identified with the name of Max Muller called Sacred Books of the East. Were any of the Itihas Purana texts translated by them? The answer is no. Yes, there was something parallelly called the Sacred Books of the Hindus, which was a later enterprise in the 1920s started from Allahabad by the Panini Press. They started this business of translating Itihas Purana, but did not go beyond a certain point. Itihas Purana is described as Pancham Veda, which means it is the dharma that householders follow. It is not just Vedanta. Vedanta, of course, exists, the Vedas exist, but this is dharma as practiced by householders. What sometimes people don't realize is that there aren't unabridged translations of these in English. Some of the Puranas that I am doing in English are being done in English for the first time. They may have been translations, not always unabridged, in the so-called vernacular languages, but not in English. To take the Mahabharata as an example, this is only the third attempt to translate all of it in unabridged form. The two earlier ones were by Kishori Mohan Ganguly in the 1880s and Manmathanath Datta in the 1890s, and mine is the third. The Valmiki Ramayana, of course, is a little bit more popular, and hence it has been translated in unabridged form 5 times. So it is not as if these texts have been translated innumerable number of times in English, sometimes never. Now, so far as the critical edition is concerned, there were different versions of the Mahabharata floating around in India with minor variations here and there. And remember, all of this used to happen through oral transmission, rendering into writing, and certainly rendering into Devanagari is of much, much later vintage. Altogether, there were more than 1200 different versions of the Mahabharata floating around with minor differences. Did Vedavyas dictate to Ganesha or did he not? When Draupadi was being disrobed, did she actually mention Krishna by name or did she not? Those kinds of minor variations. The Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune started a massive exercise in the year 1916/1917. Well, that work actually started in 1917, which was to sift through all of these texts, more than 1200 different texts, collate all of these texts, and try and determine which might have been closest to the original. Obviously, there is subjectivity in the process. No one is arguing that this was the original Mahabharata. And the way they did it is very similar to what we learned in school as HCF, highest common factor, meaning that if a shloka occurred in a large number of versions of the text, then the probability was pretty high that this was indeed the original. This is not very dissimilar to stuff that is done in the area of genetic research also. On the basis of that, they produced this critical edition in 1966. It was published across a series of volumes. Finally, the last one was published in 1966, and that's the critical edition. To give an idea of the magnitude, the 10-volume translation that I've done of the Mahabharata of the critical edition amounts to about something like 2.25 million words.
So, just to give people a sense, when you talk of 2.25 million words, 22 lakh words, a typical 300, 350 page novel in paperback form will be roughly 70 to 75,000 words. This 10 volume translation that you did of the Mahabharata is roughly, I believe, about 6,000 to 7,000 pages across those 10 volumes. So now when we now one interesting thing is that that I found when reading your translation of the Mahabharata was that the Shanti and the Anushasan Parvas take up almost 19,000 shlokas, and yet when we read the Mahabharata, the abridged versions, the the all of the other versions, for all practical purposes, the war or the story ends when the Kurukshetra war is done with, and we have a line or two saying that Bhishma gave lessons on Rajdharma and governance to Yudhishthir, and then we are done with the epic. So that begs the question: how do we look at the Shanti and the Anushasan Parvas? They form so They form a third of, or almost a third of the Mahabharata, and yet we rarely read about it, we rarely hear about it. How does one look at these two parvas?
Um, this is the problem with the dumbed down versions. In all dumbed down versions, abbreviated versions, abbreviated retellings, and those have an utility of their own. But in all of those, I tend to focus on incidents. There are incidents in the Mahabharata which transcend the Kauravas and the Pandavas. But when I'm doing the dumbed down rendering, I not only focus on incidents, I only focus on incidents that pertain to the Kauravas and the Pandavas and leave out many other interesting incidents. These texts were about dharma, and I'm taking the word dharma now in the sense of something that holds up society. Dharate sa dharma. So it was about the dharma practiced by householders, it was about the dharma practiced by kings, it was about the dharma practiced by the community, and there was a wealth of geographical information. So yes, you said the Shanti Parva and the Anushasana Parva, but there is also a lot of geographical information. There is also a lot about the ordinary practices of householders about dharma. Now, the moment I'm compressing it, I want to leave out things, and I tend to leave out things that I perceive to be, within quotes, boring. So automatically, the geographical information, the historical information, the information about the practice of householders' dharma and Raja dharma, they tend to get suppressed, which is the reason I made the point that we should actually read the unabridged versions. Maybe enticed by the dumbed down versions, I should eventually read the unabridged versions in Sanskrit. If I cannot read Sanskrit, then my translation, if not my translation, someone else's translation. Now, the way the Rajadharma, the Shanti Parva and the Anushasana Parva fit in is it's telling us about governance. And today, when we look at governance, when we look at the duty of the king, we look at the duty of the government, we tend to have all kinds of expectations that the government should do this, the government should do that, and so on and so forth. But in these texts, including the Mahabharata, we have a very clear template about what kings should do, namely protection of property rights, punishing the wicked, protecting the virtuous, ensuring internal and external security, and that was about it. A lot of the other stuff was left to individuals and communities. That's the reason these texts are important, whether it is this or whether it is Kautilya. If I talk about governance in that day and age, and I talk about economics in that day and age, most people will say Kautilya. But sometimes people are not aware that these sections of the Mahabharata that you mentioned are just as rich, if not richer, than Kautilya.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because the Mahabharata itself, we know that, and you mentioned that it is described as the Pancham Veda, and the Mahabharata itself says it's the fifth Veda. But the Mahabharata itself describes itself as a Niti Shastra, as a Dharma Shastra, and many other things. So it's interesting that these two parvas get short shrift in translations, in abridgments, in retellings. It's so now let's move to, or actually one more question on the Mahabharata. So your translation, you mentioned that yes, this is in English because English has become the language of discourse and dissemination among a large section of educated Indians, but you don't have the Sanskrit shlokas included. Now, obviously, one outcome, if you had decided to include the Sanskrit shlokas, is that the size of the translations would have roughly doubled. But is there any? So, first of all, was there any other specific reason for not including those? And secondly, can we? Is it possible we may expect an updated edition with the Sanskrit shlokas?
I don't know, meaning that if you include the Sanskrit shlokas, then the cost should go up. Obviously, it's not just the size, the cost should also go up. The question is there a market for this? For example, when I did the Bhagavad Gita, when I did the Bhagavad Gita translation, not as part of the Mahabharata translation, but as a separate independent translation, there was the Sanskrit on one side and there was the English on the other side. In this particular case, since this is based on the critical edition, and since the critical edition is readily available now, even in soft form, one could very easily match the two. So my reaction would be that my present publisher does not think there is a market. If there is any other publisher who thinks there is a market, then by all means, I will have no objections. I will get all the necessary permissions from Penguin. But some publisher has to be forthcoming. So far as the English language is concerned, I've been criticized that why are you doing it in English? Why aren't you doing it in Hindi? Now, my response to it is I am doing it in the language I'm comfortable with. This does not prevent someone else from coming along and using mine or not using mine to do a Hindi version. And there have been actually three occasions when people have come forward and said that we now want to translate your thing into whatever language. I said, I'll get you the permission. I got them the permission. After that, I didn't hear anything from them, presumably because it is not as easy a task as you tend to think it is. After all, we are talking about 80,000 shlokas. So people balked at the idea. But yes, anyone wants to do it by all means.
So let me ask you a question. 80,000 shlokas for the Mahabharata and the Harivamsha, and then another some 20,000 shlokas for the Valmiki Ramayana, and you have done another close to 35,000 shlokas for the Puranas. Uh, Walk us through your writing process, because it's not a straightforward question of simply looking at the Sanskrit shloka and writing out an English translation of that, because in every single of your translations, you have provided copious footnotes. In fact, on an average, each of your 10 volumes of the Mahabharata had literally hundreds. In some case, the footnotes exceeded 1,000. So, and you've been doing this consistently since 2010 with the Mahabharata. What does your writing process look like?
But before that, people who have read particularly the Mahabharata, the others also, the translation seriously, have told me that we find your footnotes to be extremely useful. And my attempt in the footnotes is to try and make things as comprehensible as is possible to the reader. So there are no questions left dangling. And that's the reason I spend quite a bit of time on the footnotes. Again, to give a size and give an idea of the magnitude and the hazardous task I'm embarked on, the Mahabharata has 100,000 shlokas. The Mahapurana, 18 Mahapuranas, are said to have 400,000 shlokas. I'm saying said because until you actually sit down with the translation, you don't really know how many shlokas there are in a certain text. So 400,000 shlokas will amount to upwards of 12 million words. And all the Puranas are not uniform in size. As Abhinav mentioned earlier, the ones that have been published range between 1 volume to 3 volumes, which most Puranas will have, except for two. The Padma Purana, I have no idea how many volumes it will have. It has about 55,000 shlokas, and the Skanda Purana, which has 85,000 shlokas, will roughly be the same size as the Mahabharata. I'm saving those two for the last if I'm ever able to do it. As of now, these four have been published. The Shiva Purana, which is the most difficult Purana I have translated, is waiting with the publisher. It will be published early next year. I am sort of almost through with the Brahmanda Puran. So purely in terms of numbers, you could say that I'm roughly 1/6 of the way through. Although you must realize what I said, that the Padma Purana and the Skanda Purana are huge. In terms of the process of writing, I wish I could give you a simple answer. Uh, I do not believe that multitasking ever works. Multitasking is just a buzzword, it never really works. There may be individuals who ostensibly will be multitasking, but you will find that at any one particular point in time, they are doing only one thing. However, when they are doing one particular thing, they manage to shut off everything else, and that is easier said than done. I wish I could give you a simple answer as to how this can be done, how you shut off everything else. But all I can say is over a period of time, I've managed to do that. So when I'm doing a particular translation, then I forget about everything else. And let me relate an anecdote, an incident which is relevant because my wife keeps ribbing me about this. She had gone out and I was busy translating. And she came back and she said, there was no one else in the house. She came back and she said, for heaven's sake, can't you smell the gas? And well, the gas was actually leaking. The house was filled with gas, but I had simply not noticed it. Normally, depends on whether I'm traveling or not, depends on whether there are meetings or not. But normally, I try to do something like 1500 to 2000 words every day about 1500 to 2000 words. And if for some reason I miss a day, I compensate on a subsequent day. So that's how it gets done. So a volume, any of these volumes of, let us say, 200,000 words would should not take more than about 6 months. So I've been churning out at the rate of about 2 volumes a year. uh, I should also say that except for Valmiki Ramayana, the others are all composed by Veda Vyas. So you get used to an author's style. The first volume of the Mahabharata was the most difficult. After that, you get used to the style. So when you see a certain word, you know this is what he meant. This is what was intended. And the actual process of translation is I look at the shloka, I consult all the dictionaries, whatever else I need to consult, including the footnotes. I do my translation. And then I compare it with the translators who have translated it earlier to see if there is something I have missed. So that's the process of translation. And mea culpa, it is not just for translations, but for everything else. Once something is not there on the screen anymore, I don't look at it again. I only look at it when it comes to the time of correcting proofs, which is responsible for errors sometimes creeping in. And Abhinav himself has pointed out several such errors and will continue to do so. And the reason for that is, as I just said, mea culpa. Once the page is off the screen, I don't look at it again.
Fascinating. It's a remarkable process, and you're being overtly modest in describing that, but uh, I think there's a lot for us to learn from that. Which brings me to the question of, and I want to move to I'll skip the Valmiki Ramayana in this session and I'll move to the Mahapuranas. But before I do that, I have one more question about the Mahabharata translation, but even in general. Now, yours is a translation, and you have stressed this point multiple times that you are not making it an interpretation. This is strictly a translation, even though the it's a thin line that divides an interpretation from a translation. Now, when it comes to a translation, and if you want to do this with complete fidelity, how do you draw the line when you have to select certain words? And you do try to put some explanatory comments in the footnotes, but uh, one of the reasons why a lot of people have recommended your translations is that the English flows easily, as opposed to, say, Ganguly's translation, which reads like English from the late 19th and early 20th century.
Um, you see, I know people have said that the English flows smoothly. It does not always, because I can cite Chapman's translation of Homer, or Chapman's introduction to his translation of Homer, where Chapman says that my job as a translator is to reproduce as exactly as is possible what Homer said. My English could have been better, but had I improved my English, I would not have been honest so far as the text is concerned. Quite often, I have been tempted to say much more, but I've tried to restrain myself despite that thin line between what is translation and what is interpretation. And obviously, there will be instances of interpretation, particularly because these are texts of Dharma. Now, what I have therefore tried to do is, for example, for a word, let's say there are six interpretations that are possible. Had I done a purely scholarly work, I would have given all six in the footnote. In this, consciously, because I did not want to make it too academic and pedantic, I've chosen one and I've said, look, this is not the only one that is possible. So that's the thin line that I've drawn.
So, to that point, I'd like to point out to readers and our listeners that one of the wonderful things of your translation is that you have stuck to the words and the proper nouns that have been used in the text. So, which is why, for instance, I came to learn that the Parth was a name that was given not in exclusivity to Arjun, but it was also a name used for the other Pandavas. Yudhishthir is mentioned as Parth, and the literally the hundreds of names of Sri Krishna and other gods that are used, we get to know, because you have not said that I'm going to use Krishna for all instances where he's referenced, whether it is Madhusudan, whether it is Parthasarthi, or whatever it is. Uh,
Yes, that's right. So if it is Partho, I say Partha. If it is Madhusudana, I say Madhusudana. I have been criticized on two counts, and I should mention those. And I'm still not very sure where I stand on those. One is the lack of an index. Now, the problem with an index is we couldn't really make up our minds about what to include and what to exclude. And that was the reason why there is no index. The other reason why I have been criticized is not using diacritical marks. Not using diacritical marks makes proper names and geographical names difficult to pronounce. I am still somewhat ambivalent about whether one should use diacritical marks or not, because diacritical marks tend to put off readers. There are instances where one has learned as one has gone along, because one's skills hopefully also improve as one translates more and more. For example, in hindsight, I think that in the Valmiki Ramayana, I would have should have stuck to the usage of the word Vanara instead of trying to translate it. But what has happened as a part of that process of translation is I've become a bit more confident about using relatively more Sanskrit words. These days, every instance of dharma, I will leave it as dharma. Earlier, maybe in some cases, I would have sought to translate it.
right. And so, on the use of diacritical marks, I tend to agree that while on the one hand it makes the pronunciation unambiguous to the English reader, but on the other hand, wherever and whenever I've read the translations with diacritical marks, they have tended to slow down my pace of reading. And I suspect the same would be the case for a lot of other readers. Perhaps for maybe a future translations, you may want to consider having a couple of pages at the beginning or at the end with the name and perhaps the Devanagari translation, so that if in doubt, and those interested, they can refer to the to the pronunciation guide.
That's not a bad idea. But if one does it, I am inclined to prefer Devanagari over the IAST and the diacritical marks, because I think most people, at least certainly most Indians, are comfortable with Devanagari. And in the diacritical marks and IAST, it's often very easy to miss out the dots and the little squiggle at the top. Yeah, so maybe one could possibly do that.
Excellent. Uh, let's take a couple of questions that have come in, and then I'll move to the Mahapuranas, and specifically the Vishnu Puran. So Sai Swarupa, she has a question: when can we expect the Brahman Puran?
Um, well, there's always a time lag between my submitting it to the publisher and it actually being published. The Shiva Purana, as I said, it was a very difficult text to translate, and there is some Sanskrit in it, in could not be avoided. So earlier, the Shiva Purana was slotted for December 2022. I'm now told it will be February 2023. So the Brahmanda Purana would be second half of 2023 at some point.
So you mentioned this before also. Why was the Shiv Purana so difficult to translate? What made the translation a difficult job?
Mm, okay. You see, there is a Vaishnava Dharma. The Vaishnava Dharma, it has, for want of a better word, it has a theology of its own. And that builds on the Bhagavad Gita, is expounded in much greater detail in the Bhagavat Puran, is there to some extent even in Vishnu Puran. Similarly, the Shaiva Dharma is built up in Shiva Purana. Generally, I think we are much more familiar with the theology of Vaishnava Dharma compared to the theology of Shaiva Dharma. Let me give an example of that. Most people will have a smattering, a perfunctory knowledge, if not a detailed knowledge, of the principles of Sankhya and the 24, 25, 26 principles of Sankhya. For Shaiva Dharma, we have 36. Now, unless you are from Kashmir, unless you've read Abhinav Gupta, unless you've read Tantra, you will not necessarily be familiar with this. There are a lot of mantras in the rituals in the Shiva Purana. So, all of those mantras I needed to understand. And I needed to track down, because when the mantra is referred to, it is referred to in a very cryptic kind of way. So I needed to, because I wanted to be fair to the reader, this is the point about the footnotes. So I needed to track down what is the original, where is that original from. Now that made it a much more difficult exercise than the others.
Interesting. And would would one be accurate in saying that part of the difficulty also arose from the fact that there are hardly any unabridged translations that have been done of the Shiv Puran?
Um, Partly yes, and partly I wonder whether I should use this word. Yes, perhaps I should. Partly the translators have been sloppy. You see, what do I mean by that? My training is that of a researcher. So when I translate, my tendency is to, what does it mean? How do you know this? Where did it come from? And translators have been somewhat sloppy on these matters. Whenever they've found something to be difficult, they've just glossed over it.
Ah,
So yes, you're right.
so let's move to the Mahapurans then, right? Uh, the three-volume Bhagavad Puran, the one-volume Markandeya Puran, the two-volume Brahma Puran and now the one-volume Vishnu Puran are what you have translated and have been published so far. And the Shiv Puran and the Brahman Puran are in the pipeline. Now, we often hear words like the Puran, Mahapuran, Sthal Puran, Upapuran, even the Mahabharata at times, though not often, has been referred to as a Puran. The Harivamsha has been called a Puran, even though you write that, strictly speaking, the Mahabharata refers to the Harivamsha as an appendix, as a keel. How does one or who? How do we? Who did these segregations that this is a Mahapuran, Upapuran, Sthal Puran, and so on?
Um, at one level, we don't know. Now, let me digress for a minute. If I look at the Mahabharata today and I ask people, they will say, oh, the Mahabharata has 18 parvas. But those 18 parvas exist today. By no way can one argue that the original Mahabharata was actually divided into 18 parvas. The 18 parva classification may have come later. Exactly similarly, when one looks at the Valmiki Ramayana, there are people who will say, oh, Uttar Kanda was later. But the seven Kanda classification itself was later, and there are later sections not only in Uttar Kanda but Balakanda also. Similarly, there are older sections in Uttar Kanda also. So we must understand that the texts today are not the texts as they originally were. Originally, there was probably one major consolidated Purana Sanghita, which, and the Puranas were clearly composed in different parts of the country because different Puranas exhibit different degrees of knowledge about the geography of the country. Over a period of time, we have 18 Mahapuranas, and all the texts say that there are 18 Mahapuranas. We have a listing of these 18 Mahapuranas, their names, Mahapuranas as in major Puranas. For example, the Matsya Purana names these 18 Mahapuranas. In addition, you have, as Abhinav said, what are called Upapuranas. Upapuranas are minor Puranas. The listing of the Upapuranas will vary from one part of the country to another part of the country. So, in some part of the country, in the eastern parts, people will say Kalika Purana is an Upapurana. In the western parts of the country, people will say Ganesha Purana is an Upapurana. So the Upapuranas, there may be 18, there may be many more, but there is no consensus about the lists. So far as the Mahapuranas are concerned, there is more or less consensus about which are the 18 that are included in that list. Sometimes you will find Vayu Purana not mentioned. Instead, you will find Bhavishya Purana mentioned. But those are minor deviations. Sometimes when you find Bhagavat Purana, most people will say this stands for the Bhagavata Purana or Bhagavatam, as in the Vishnu related Bhagavatam. There are some who will argue, no, it should be the Devi Bhagavatam. But that apart, there is a reasonable degree of consensus in the listing mentioned in several Puranas, including the Matsya Purana.
So that begs the question that when you talk of that you're doing this Mahapuran translation, do you have a number of 18 in mind, or are you planning on expanding it to maybe include 19 or maybe 20 to include all of the generally accepted Mahapuranas?
Well, as I said, the Padma Puran and the Skanda Puran are going to take a long time, and there is a limited amount of time one spends in this mortal body. But if I am able to complete these 18, I do want to do the Devi Bhagavat Purana. I am not very sure about the Bhavishya Purana, but I do want to do the Devi Bhagavat Purana if I am able to complete these 18.
Well, I'm sure you will. Our best wishes are obviously with you, and if nothing else works, we can always troll you on Twitter to do that. One question that has come from Sridhar is that the Itihasa and the Puranas have spiritual context. Do you think they have more than spiritual takeaways. And I think you said you covered this earlier in your in one of your answers, that they concern so many other things about the, say for example, the duties of the king, the Shanti and the Anushasan Parvas, the Raj Dharma, the Apad Dharma, the Moksha Dharma Parvas. They talk about a lot of these things. But anything you want to add to what you have already said?
Um, well, I'm not sure. I read the question. I'm not very sure about what one means by a spiritual context, because, as I said earlier, they are about dharma. Dharma itself, of course, has many dimensions. Other than the Raja Dharma, there are the three or four Purusharthas: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. And the Itihas Purana corpus is about pursuit of all four: Dharma, and there are different dimensions of Dharma. And so, at one level, the Puranas, they are also, the Itihas Purana corpus, they are also about what is called Adhyatma, which essentially means asking questions about who you are, why am I here, and uh, such things. But everything is a function of the individual concern. It is like a mobile call, depending on the receptivity of the quality of the instrument, as well as the receptivity of the, as well as the quality of the signal. So what one discovers, from what one finds as a takeaway from a text like this, is very much a function of who the reader is.
Okay, I didn't realize I was muted. Uh, so, coming to the Vishnu Puran, your latest translation, this is uh, now okay. So, the first question is that you mentioned that traditionally the Vishnu Puran has been thought of a lot many shlokas. I forget the number, possibly more than 15,000 shlokas. But the edition that you used, which has been published by Nag Publishers, I think they came out in the 1980s. This has only roughly about 7,000 shlokas. So how does one explain this cutting down from 15 to 7,000? And the same is was the case with the Markandeya Puran also. Why do we
Um,
talk of them as having so many more shlokas, but when it actually comes down to using some sort of an authorized, reputed edition, the number of shlokas is a lot less?
uh, Before that, just a digression on the nature of the Vishnu Purana. A Purana is supposed to have five characteristics, Pancha Lakshana. A Purana is supposed to describe the original creation and the final dissolution. This is the this is Sarga. So it has to describe that. It has to describe the subsidiary cycles of creation and dissolution, called Pratisarga. So that's the second. Thirdly, we have a classification of time. We have a double classification of time. One of it is in terms of the yugas, the Satya, Treta, Dwapar, and Kali, and the other one is in terms of the Manantaras. So the third attribute of a Purana is that it must describe the Manantaras. Fourth is it must describe the creation and origin of devas and rishis. And finally, it must describe the genealogy of Surya Vansha and Chandra Vansha, or the genealogies of the kings. So these are the five characteristics that a Purana must satisfy. However, the Puranas are much more than that. The Puranas are encyclopedias. They have geography, they have practices, all kinds of things. So they transcend these narrow five Pancha Lakshanas. The only Purana which sticks to the straight and the narrow and does not deviate at all is the Vishnu Purana. The Vishnu Purana sticks only to these 5 characteristics. The Vishnu Purana does not have this encyclopedic characteristic that others tend to have. I said that the Puranas evolved over a period of time. The edition that I've used, I wanted, there aren't critical editions of all the Puranas. Unlike the Mahabharata, for which the Bori text is the critical edition, similarly for the Valmiki Ramayana, the Baroda edition is the critical text. For the Puranas, we don't yet have critical editions. The work has started on a critical edition, including that for the Skanda Purana, but I wanted to use a source that was common across all the translations. Hence, I used the edition that Abhinav mentioned, which is the Nag Prakashan, which is based on texts that were brought out towards the turn of the last century by Nirnay Sagar, and most scholars regard it as authentic. So this is based on the Nirnay Sagar edition. The first Purana to be translated into English, by the way, there was a historical tradition which has now died out thanks to the Asiatic Society, which in the 19th century began to bring out Sanskrit texts of some of these Puranas. In that day and age, Haraprasad Shastri traveled through Nepal, got a manuscript of the Devi Mahatya section of the Markandeya Purana from the Royal Library in Kathmandu, brought it up. Anyway, so the first Purana to be translated into English was the Vishnu Purana by Wilson in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. Wilson, because he based it on the Vishnu Purana, he built up the Vishnu Purana and used it almost like a touchstone to validate the genealogical lists of the other Puranas. So it was almost as if the other Puranas were being dismissed. Now, the reason I'm saying this is there are some Puranas which are read quite a lot. The Bhagavat Purana is an example of that. It is read quite a lot, particularly the 10th Skandha is read quite a lot. A Purana that is read quite a lot, over a period of time, the text tends to become a bit more clean and a bit more perfect. You don't have a lot of typos and errors. Some of the other Puranas that I'm now in the business of translating have a lot of errors, clear typos. The Brahmanda Purana being an example of that. Vishnu Purana is not like that. Markandeya Purana is not like that. Bhagavat Purana is not like that.
So, when it comes to the question of typos, you have pointed out typos even in the critical editions, especially the later sections. You have pointed out that there seem to be typos. Now, it's not surprising that the Brahmanda Purana and some of the lesser known Puranas will have these typos. But if every Puran, every of the 18 Mahapuranas are supposed to have these Panchalakshan, a natural question might be, then isn't there going to be a huge amount of repetition in each one of them, especially when they're talking about these 5 qualities, attributes? And secondly, they don't all concur with each other. There are minor and sometimes not so minor variations in each one of them. So someone reading the Mahapuranas, how does the person, he or she, come back with the okay, what is the authentic, the fixation that we often have, that what is the authentic information on this? If I'm looking at genealogy, if I'm looking at any other aspect, how does one reconcile that?
I'm not very sure whether one should ask that question at all or not. Maybe they can never be reconciled. Maybe someday someone like Avinav will actually prepare a consolidated Purana which removes these consistencies across. But let me recount something from the Shiva Purana, and I'm recounting this as an example of something that's not very familiar. All of us know Sati gave up her life in Daksha's yajna, because Shiva was criticized, and then she became Parvati. Why did this happen? There is a story in the Shiva Purana, and I'm mentioning this because it is not familiar, it's not known, that before Shiva married Sati, he said, I will marry a lady as long as she trusts me. The day she stops trusting me, there'll be problems. So here were Rama and Lakshmana wandering around looking for Sita, and Shiva and Sati were there. And Sati said, who's this person wandering around like this, miserable? Shiva says, that is Vishnu's avatar, Rama. Sati says, I don't believe you. How can Vishnu's avatar be like this? So she goes and tests. Now she had betrayed this lack of trust. As a result of this, it was destined that Shiva and Sati would be separated. Now, this is the Shiva Purana. Question: how many people know this? They
I
don't.
did.
Similarly, Radha. Where does the name Radha appear? You read Wikipedia, everyone reads Wikipedia or the net. Oh, Radha first surfaces in Brahma Vaivarta Purana. I'm translating the Brahmanda Purana now, which has a huge section on Parashurama. And Parashurama, to obtain success in slaying Kartavirya Arjuna, has to pray to Krishna. To keep the story short, Krishna appears with Radha, and Radha is described as Krishna's wife. I did not know this. I doubt too many Vaishnava devotees would know this. So there are all of these differences and nuggets of information in the Puranas, which is why I think one should translate them, read them.
Fascinating. Uh, I'm still not through the Vishnu Purana translation of yours, but now I'm already looking forward to the Shiv and then the Brahmand Purana translations. For those of you, let me do a quick recap. We are speaking with Shri Bibek Debroy. He is the translator of the unabridged Mahabharata, Harivamsha, Valmiki, Ramayana, and now the 18 Mahapuranas. And these are the unabridged translations in the English language. All of them have been published by Penguin and are available in both paperback and ebook editions. So, and I must share this: if you keep a close eye on a site like Amazon, for instance, where the Kindle ebook edition is available, often enough you will find them available at a heavily discounted price. So while knowledge has no price, purchasing a book that contains that knowledge can certainly be subject to price checks and all. You will get them at a fairly reasonable price. So uh, that is one suggestion. Now, in I don't have. I'll take one question from Sri Megh Kalyan Sundaram. He asked, "Thank you for your contribution, Dr. Debroy. With the benefit of hindsight, if you were to do anything differently, what might be the top two or three?"
Mm, that's a question I don't really know the answer to, because I said right at the beginning, at a philosophical level, I'm inclined to think I am not taking a conscious decision to do these translations. These decisions are being taken for me. And had the time and the place not been right, had my destiny not happened in that way, I probably would not have started it. Having said that, and attached that caveat, I wish I had started earlier. Had I had the free choice, which I don't think I did, I should have started 10 years earlier. Then I'd have been a little bit more confident about completing the translations I intend to do.
And it is not for lack of because the fact is that your output has been fairly prolific. It's if it's not the translations, you're authoring or you're co-authoring or you're editing books. So it's it almost becomes a challenge, whether one can read what you write faster than how fast you can write them. But interesting, because you did several years before you started the Mahabharata translation, you had published a translation of the Bhagavad Gita, right?
Yes, yes. Um,
So there are, and one of your books that came out, I believe, a couple of years back was Bhagavad Gita for Millennials, where you do mention that the Mahabharata itself has got several Gitas in it, including the Anu Gita
yes,
and the Ashtavakra Gita and all.
yeah. Okay,
But
so two
yeah.
kinds of responses to that. You see, the Bhagavad Gita for millennials seems to have struck the right chord with readers. So I've just done something unrelated to the translations, or not directly related to the translations. I've just done something called Devi for millennials. The publisher is not Penguin. Devi for millennials, the publisher is Rupa. So this should be out at the time of Navaratri, explaining concept of Devi to readers.
Oh,
The,
fantastic.
sec- the second one is, as Avinav said, depending on how you count, there are around 60 different Gitas. A bunch of them in the Mahabharata. There are around 20 Gitas in the Mahabharata. Um, Regardless of whether they are actually described as Gita or not. For example, Yaksha Prashna is not avowedly described as a Gita, but I think it belongs to the spirit of the Gita. Abhinav mentioned the Anu Gita, which is, of course, the only other Gita where Krishna is actually speaking to Arjuna. But there is something like the Dharma Vadha Gita, which is much more pertinent for householders. So you have a bunch of about 20 Gitas in the Mahabharata. You have a bunch of around 20 Gitas that are in the Puranas, not in the Mahabharata. Uddhav Gita is an example of that. Devi Gita and the Devi Bhagavat Purana is an example of that. And you have a bunch of Gitas that are standalone Gitas. Ashtavakra Gita is an example of that. I had wanted to do 3 volumes of translations with the Sanskrit. Volume 1, Mahabharata Gitas. Volume 2, Purana Gitas. Volume 3, Gitas that are not in the Mahabharata or in the Puranas. Of these, the Mahabharata Gitas is sitting with the publisher, but we have delayed publication till probably next year. This is Rupa. The Purana Gitas, I'm not very sure, because effectively in Devi for millennials, I have translated Devi Gita. I'm doing a book with I'm doing a book with a co-author. I hesitated about mentioning his name, with a co-author on Ashtavakra Gita. So the Ashtavakra Gita, I am in the process of translating in any case.
Okay, just when we thought your output couldn't be more prolific, we will look forward to those translations. We are right at the very top of the hour. I believe we have taken in all the questions that have come. There is one from Shiva who asks, when will the Shiva Purana come out? And you did mention it's coming out in February of next year. So, Shri Bibek Debroy, sir, thank you so much for your time and for taking our questions and spending time in answering them. We look forward to your translations, and I think we have only barely begun to scratch the surface of all the things we want to ask you. So I look forward to a second discussion with you in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. Anytime.
Thank you, gentlemen, and all for watching. This video is available on YouTube, and we will add it to our list of author Q&As. And you can follow Indica Books on Twitter at Indica Books. You can join our Facebook group You can take part in the 1,000 Reviewers Club initiative. And we look forward to continuing the discussion with you. And thank you so much and namaskar for joining in.